The first thing Nathan felt was the cold. It wasn't the kind that made him shiver. It was deeper, seeping into his bones, a weight pressing against his skin like unseen hands. He tried to breathe, but the air was thick, heavy, with a dampness that clung to his throat. Then came the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but an unnatural void, as if the world itself had stopped listening. No wind, no distant hum of life, just his own heartbeat, slow and uncertain. He opened his eyes. Darkness stretched endlessly before him, not like night, but a void, a world drained of light. Shapes loomed in the distance, jagged and shifting, neither solid nor transparent. The ground beneath his feet was slick, pulsing as though alive, veins of dim light flickering beneath its surface. Nathan didn't remember how he got here. The last thing he recalled was falling into a depthless black, his body weightless, pulled downward by an unseen force. And now, he stood on the edge of something vast and wrong. A whisper brushed his ear. Soft, almost gentle. Keep walking. His breath hitched. He turned, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness stretching endlessly behind him. The whisper came again, closer this time. You don't belong here. Nathan took a step forward. The ground pulsed beneath him, the veins of dim light flaring at his touch. He didn't know where he was going. Only that standing still felt worse than moving. Somewhere in the distance, something stirred. A shape detached itself from the darkness, slow and deliberate. Nathan couldn't make out its form, only the way the void twisted around it, as if it were bending reality itself. And then it moved. Fast, straight toward him. He ran. Nathan's footsteps echoed unnaturally as he ran, the sound bouncing back at him from the shifting darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air scraping his lungs like tiny unseen claws. The thing behind him was close, too close. He could feel it, a presence pressing against the back of his skull, thick and suffocating, like a hand about to close around his throat. He didn't dare look back. The ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. It pulsed with each step sinking slightly, as if he were running across something that breathed. The veins of dim light flickered erratically, casting twisted shadows that didn't match his movements. Shapes loomed around him, towering figures, wrapped in tattered black, watching, motionless. He could feel their hollow eyes following him, their silence heavier than the void itself. A scream split through the air, not his. A woman's voice, raw, broken, filled with a terror that made his stomach churn. It came from ahead, from somewhere deep within the shifting landscape. Nathan hesitated. The thing chasing him hadn't stopped. Its presence clawed at the edges of his mind, a cold that seeped beneath his skin. But the scream, whoever she was trapped here too, and she was in pain. Another scream, more desperate this time. Nathan clenched his fists, forcing down the panic, and ran toward the sound. The darkness around him thickened, pressing in like something alive, something hungry. His vision blurred, his head growing heavy, but he didn't stop. Then suddenly, silence. The scream was gone, and so was the path beneath his feet. Nathan barely had time to gasp before the ground collapsed and he was falling again, downward, deeper, into the hollow nothing waiting below. The house was never truly silent. Even when the wind outside stilled and the night pressed thick against the windows, the old wooden bones of the place whispered. Faint groans from the rafters, soft pops beneath the floorboards, an uneasy shifting in the walls. Alone in the dim candlelight, Daniel sat stiffly in the armchair, his fingers curled around a half-empty glass of wine, listening. The house listened back. A fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, its glow stretching long shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the forest loomed, black and depthless beyond the large window, its trees swaying without wind. He stared into that darkness, his pulse a slow, steady thud against his ribs. Something felt wrong tonight. It wasn't the isolation. He had spent enough evenings alone in this place to welcome the quiet. It wasn't even the storm that had passed earlier, leaving behind an eerie stillness in its wake. No, this was different. A weight in the air. A pressure he couldn't place. The candle on the nearby table flickered violently, guttering for a brief moment before steadying again. The flame bent as though something unseen had brushed past it. Daniel's grip on the glass tightened. Then soft, almost imperceptible, a sound. A creak, not from the old house settling, not from the wind. This was deliberate. A footstep. His breath caught. He turned his head slightly, listening, every nerve in his body going rigid. The sound had come from the hallway, just beyond the doorway leading into the main hall. His eyes flickered to the staircase that wound up into the second floor, where darkness stretched like an open mouth. He was alone here, wasn't he? The fire crackled again, louder this time, snapping his attention back to the room. His pulse pounded as he set the glass down carefully on the small wooden table beside him. His ears strained for any further noise, but the house had gone still once more. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair, but the sense of unease didn't leave him. His gaze returned to the window, to the endless sprawl of trees outside. The moon barely pierced through the dense canopy, casting the forest in a patchwork of shifting darkness. Then movement, a shadow just beyond the tree line. Daniel sat up sharply, his stomach twisting. The figure was there, just for a moment, barely more than a distortion in the blackness. He blinked, and it was gone. The candlelight shuddered again. A cold prickle crawled down the back of his neck. Then, bang, a sharp, deafening crash from outside. A violent force slamming against the front porch. Daniel's breath left him in a shudder. He couldn't move, couldn't blink. His fingers dug into the arms of the chair as the echo of the impact rattled through the house. Silence fell again, but the weight in the air had changed. Something was out there. And now? It knew he was too. The house loomed behind him, its dark windows reflecting nothing but the abyss of the forest. Daniel hesitated on the porch, breath shallow, as the cold night air pressed against his skin. The sound, that terrible bang, had come from just beyond the steps, where the grass met the tree line. The forest was silent, too silent. His fingers curled tighter around the flashlight in his hand, its weak beam cutting into the thick dark. The trees stood like towering sentinels, their branches twisted in unnatural shapes. Something about them felt wrong, like they had shifted when he wasn't looking. He took a step forward, then another. The damp earth gave under his weight. The scent of moss and wet wood thickened his nose. His breath puffed in the cold, a thin cloud in the stillness. Then, his foot hit something. A dull clunk. He froze. The flashlight's beam swept downward, revealing something half buried in the leaves, a shape, small and broken. A dollar. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing, the remaining one wide and lifeless, reflecting the dim light. Its tiny arms were outstretched, as if reaching for something, something unseen, something lost. The fabric of its dress was soaked in mud, frayed and torn. Daniel swallowed. $1. Out here in the middle of the forest, a gust of wind rattled the branches overhead. Or was it the wind? He bent down, fingers trembling as he reached for it. A whisper. Faint. So faint he wasn't sure he heard it at all. But it was there, drifting from the trees. A voice. He jerked upright, scanning the woods. Nothing. The flashlight flickered. His stomach twisted. His instinct screamed at him to leave it, to turn back, to lock the doors and pretend this night had never happened. But something about the doll, something wrong, held him in place. Slowly, he picked it up. It was ice cold. A distant snap of a branch made him whip around, heart hammering. But there was still no movement. No sign of anything out there. Just the trees. And the silence. Daniel exhaled sharply and turned back toward the house. He didn't run. He wouldn't let himself, but his steps were quicker than before. His breath tight in his chest. The doll hung limply in his grip, its broken face tilted upward, watching. Inside, the house felt different. The warmth of the fire should have been comforting, but instead, it made the shadows dance in unnatural ways, flickering against the walls like grasping fingers. The air was thick, suffocating. Daniel placed the doll on the wooden table beside his armchair, trying to ignore the unease twisting in his gut. Then from behind him, a soft thump. He turned sharply. The doll had moved. Not much, just slightly, its tiny body slumped in a different position than before. He stared, pulse drumming in his ears. He hadn't touched it, had he? A whisper. This time, he heard it clearly, soft, close. Daniel. His blood ran cold. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. And in the corner of the room, where the darkness was deepest, something shifted. The whispers didn't stop. Daniel heard them in the walls, in the wind, in the spaces where sound should not exist. At first they were distant, soft murmurs at the edge of hearing, brushing against his thoughts like unseen fingertips. But now they followed him. They knew his name. Daniel. The fire in the hearth had burned low, its light barely reaching the farthest corners of the room. Shadows stretched unnaturally, shifting even when he wasn't moving. He had locked the doors, checked the windows twice, but it didn't matter. The house was no longer a place of safety. Something was inside with him. He sat rigid in his chair, staring at the doll where it lay on the wooden table. He had moved it twice, first to the kitchen, then to a locked drawer, but each time he turned around and it was back. Its cracked porcelain face was always tilted slightly upward, as if it was listening. Outside, the wind had picked up, whispering through the trees. But the sound was wrong. The wind didn't speak. Then, slam. A door. From somewhere inside the house. Daniel shot to his feet, heart hammering. He turned, scanning the room, breath coming in sharp gasps. The hallway leading to the staircase yawned with darkness. The upstairs beyond it, unseen. He wasn't going up there. Not tonight. Another sound, slow, deliberate. A soft creak from the far end of the hall, like weight shifting on old floorboards. Someone was inside. Daniel's hand clenched into a fist. He needed a weapon. Something, anything. Then something glinted in the dim candlelight. The mirror above the fireplace. His reflection was there, but it wasn't right. The image was too slow, lagging behind his movements by a heartbeat. His chest rose and fell in the mirror a second too late. He swallowed, stepping closer. His reflection stared back at him, wide-eyed, unblinking. Then it smiled. Daniel staggered back. His reflection had smiled, but he hadn't. Cold terror flooded his veins, his stomach lurching. His own face, still frozen in horror, stared back at him in the glass. The smile widened. Then the lights flickered, the shadows stretched, the whispers grew louder. And then the floor creaked behind him. Daniel spun, heart in his throat. The darkness in the hallway moved. Not a trick of the light. Something inside it shifted. The house groaned, the wood beneath his feet trembling as if breathing. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, his eyes landed on the farthest corner of the hallway. A door, one that had never been there before. A basement. The stairs were older than the house itself. The wood was damp, slick with something that smelled of earth and rot. Daniel's breath came in short bursts as he descended, flashlight trembling in his grip. The basement was wrong. It wasn't a storage space, nor a cellar. It was a room meant to be forgotten. The walls were stone, damp with moisture, carved with symbols that made his stomach churn just looking at them. The air was thick, heavy, like it didn't belong to this world. Then, in the center of the room, he saw it, a table, and on it, a journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words inside were not meant to be read. Each entry was scrawled in frantic, uneven strokes. The same sentence repeated again and again between desperate ramblings. We should have never brought it here. Daniel's fingers shook as he flipped through the pages. Dates from over a century ago. Stories of a family plagued by whispers, by shadows, by something that watched. The last entry was short, smudged, as if written in a trembling hand. The doll moves now. We cannot stop it. Daniel's stomach dropped. A sound from above. A floorboard creaked. His breath hitched. Someone was in the house. He turned, the basement door still open, the stairway leading back into the suffocating dark. He had to move. Daniel ran. His room was cold when he slammed the door shut. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. Then he saw it. His breath left him in a sharp, shaking exhale. There, sitting on his bed, waiting, the doll, its cracked face smiling, and its single lifeless eye locked directly on him. The night called to him. Daniel didn't know why. He only knew that the pull was relentless, a force deep in his chest, dragging him toward the trees. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't bravery. It was something else. Something that wanted him to leave the house, to step into the darkness where it waited. Where they waited. He had tried to resist. After finding the doll in his room, he had locked every door, every window, shoved a chair beneath the handle to keep whatever was inside the howlers from reaching him. But it hadn't mattered. Because now, outside the window, someone was whispering his name. Daniel? Software gentle, right against the glass, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. The forest loomed beyond the porch, its trees twisting into grotesque shapes against the night sky. He gripped his flashlight like a lifeline, his breath a cloud of fog in the cold air. Every rational thought screamed for him to turn back, to stay inside, to forget whatever was calling to him. But he stepped forward anyway, and the trees swallowed him whole. The air was thick, heavy. The moment he crossed into the tree line, the world changed. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, only silence. The kind that pressed against the skin like damp cloth, suffocating and wrong. The flashlight cut through the black in weak, hazy beams, barely illuminating the twisted roots beneath his feet. The ground was soft, almost breathing, the damp earth shifting slightly as he stepped. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. The trees stood too close together, their branches curling like skeletal fingers, watching. The deeper he walked, the more the feeling grew. An unbearable sensation of eyes. Not one or two, but hundreds, hidden in the bark, in the roots, in the shadows, where his flashlight couldn't reach. Then the voices started. Whispers, low, curling around him like smoke. Daniel, come closer. His pulse pounded against his ribs. His fingers clenched around the flashlight, sweat slicking his grip. He turned sharply, the beam slicing through the trees. But there was nothing. Just darkness. Then a giggle. Not human. A distorted, sickly laugh that sounded like it came from a throat filled with water. Too close. His breath hitched, the ground beneath him sank. Daniel staggered, looking down. His foot had pressed into something soft, wet, like flesh. He yanked it back with a sharp inhale, his stomach twisting. The earth pulsed beneath him, veins of something black and alive writhing just beneath the surface. A shadow moved between the trees, not like an animal, not like a person. It was tall, thin, its limbs too long, too slow. It didn't walk. It glided, its shape flickering at the edges like something caught between this world and another. And it was following him. Daniel's breathing turned shallow. He took a step back, then another, his foot snagging on an exposed root. He stumbled, catching himself just before hitting the ground. Then suddenly, the trees opened, and he stood before the stone circle. Massive stones jutted from the ground in uneven, jagged arcs covered in deep carvings, symbols that twisted his stomach just looking at them. The air was colder here, heavy with something ancient, and in the center, a pile of bones, not animal bones, human. Daniel's stomach lurched, his breath came in sharp gasps as his flashlight trembled in his grip. The whispers grew louder now, hissing from the stones, from the earth, from the shadows closing in behind him. And then, the figure stepped forward. Daniel's throat clenched. It stood at the edge of the circle, half hidden in darkness. 7 feet tall, limbs unnaturally long. Its face a hollow void, but its head tilted slightly. Watching, waiting. His flashlight flickered. Run, the voices whispered. Run, the figure twitched. And his flashlight died. Total darkness, total silence. And something moved, right beside him. Darkness wrapped around Daniel like a living thing, thick and smothering. The moment his flashlight died, the whispers changed. They were no longer distant. No longer just voices in the trees. They were inside his head. Don't turn around. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. The figure in the darkness, it was still there. He could feel it. Waiting, watching. The earth pulsed beneath his feet, a slow, sickly rhythm, as if something deep below was breathing. Then a sound, a new one, dripping, thick, wet, close. His heart slammed against his ribs. He had to move. He had to run. The whispers shrieked as he bolted into the trees, branches clawing at his skin, roots twisting beneath his feet. The darkness moved with him, stretching, shifting, warping the space around him. His body screamed for rest, but he didn't stop, not until the trees thinned and he saw it. A cabin, old, rotting, swallowed by the forest, and something was inside. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the still air. Daniel hesitated at the threshold. The air inside the cabin was wrong. It smelled of rot and something deeper, something ancient, His fingers trembled as he fumbled with his flashlight, smacking it against his palm until... Flicker. The beam was weak, sputtering, but enough to reveal the nightmare within. Blood. It streaked the wooden walls, smeared in handprints and symbols he couldn't understand. The floor was littered with bones, not scattered, but arranged carefully in spirals. A message. At the center of the room stood a chair, and in that chair, a body. Daniel's stomach turned. The figure was slumped forward, its arms tied to the armrests with strips of old cloth. The head lolled to the side at an unnatural angle. The skin, gray, withered, pulled tight against bone. The mouth was stitched shut. A book lay open on the table beside the corpse. A journal. He stepped forward, his breath hitching. The pages were old, stained with something dark. The writing was erratic, frantic. It won't let us leave. The door below. It beats like a heart. The whispers are inside me now. Daniel swallowed hard, flipping to the last page. The ink was smeared, the words barely legible. We should have never buried it. Thump. Daniel froze. The sound had come from beneath him. A low, deep pulse, like a heartbeat. The floor shuddered. Daniel staggered back, his flashlight flickering. Then he saw it. A trapdoor, half hidden beneath a ragged rug. The edges were splintered, the wood dark with something wet. He shouldn't. But the whispers were pulling him down. He grasped the rusted handle and pulled. The tunnel stretched into black infinity. Daniel's flashlight barely cut through the dark as he descended the ladder, each rung slick with moisture. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if he was breathing something not meant for lungs. The walls were wrong. Not stone, not wood. They were fleshy, soft, pulsing, alive. His fingers brushed against them, and something moved beneath the surface, shifting away from his touch. He swallowed the rising bile in his throat. Bones jutted from the ground, some human, some not. Claw marks dug deep into the tunnel walls, long and erratic, as if something had tried to escape. The whispers were louder now. Closer. Then he saw it. At the tunnel's end, nestled in the writhing living walls. A door, massive, pulsating. A thing of flesh and veins, its surface wet and twitching. Each slow movement syncing with the deep, pounding heartbeat. It was alive, and it was locked. Daniel's breath came in short, panicked bursts as the whispers shifted. No longer words, but a sickening, hungry sound. And then, something moved behind him. The door breathed. Daniel stood before it, his pulse a violent hammer against his ribs. The thing was alive, its surface twitching, veins bulging and receding as though something within it was struggling to break free. The heartbeat, slow, deep, rhythmic, echoed through the tunnel, matching the erratic pound of his own. The whispers had stopped. For the first time since stepping into this nightmare, there was silence. But silence was worse, because it meant they were waiting. His hand trembled as he reached for the latch, his fingers slick with sweat. It was cold, unnaturally so, like touching ice wrapped in dead skin. He took a breath and pulled. The door ripped open with a sickening wet squelch. Beyond it, not a room, not a tunnel, but a void. A vast open expanse bathed in a ghostly, bluish glow. The walls stretched into nothingness, shimmering like light through deep water. The air was thick, suffocating, but there was no wind, no movement, nothing. Then the first shadow appeared. Daniel's breath hitched. It wasn't human. A hunched figure, arms elongated, neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its mouth, too wide, too black, too wrong, hung open in a silent scream. Then another figure emerged, and another, dozens, hundreds, surrounding him. Their bodies flickered like dying candlelight, shifting between shapes, their faces morphing between agony and rage. The air shook with their presence, the silence now unbearable. Daniel took a step back, and the first apparition pointed straight at him. A shrill, inhuman wail tore through the silence. The others followed, hundreds of ghostly hands accusing him, their fingers contorted, shaking with fury. The screams built, a crescendo of pure, seething hatred, growing louder, louder, louder. Then a voice, low, familiar. "You did this." Daniel's stomach dropped. The whisper was inside him. No, behind him. Slowly, unwillingly, he turned. A single figure stood apart from the others, not flickering, not shifting, real. And he knew that face. His own. Daniel staggered back, his breath a ragged choke. His own reflection stared at him, its expression twisted into something unreadable. A sickening mix of recognition, rage, and something worse, understanding. Then it spoke. "You were never supposed to come back." Daniel shook his head, stepping away. The whispers had turned to screams, a chorus of agony shaking the very air. Memories crashed into him, blood, buried secrets, a door that should have never been opened. He saw flashes, his family, generations before him, their hands stained, trembling, rituals whispered in the dark. The doll was never just a doll. It was a vessel, a curse, and he had brought it back. Daniel's vision blurred. His reflection moved toward him, but he couldn't run. His legs wouldn't obey. The air thickened, pressing against his chest, choking him. The figures around him drew closer, their arms reaching, pulling him in. The screams became unbearable, and then the door behind him slammed shut, trapping him. The door was gone. Daniel spun, gasping for breath, but the pulsating, flesh-like doorway that had led him into this nightmare had vanished. Only darkness remained. The whispers were no longer just around him. They were inside him, tearing at the edges of his mind, slithering into his thoughts, digging into his soul. His body trembled violently. The ghostly figures loomed closer, their hollow faces stretching in endless torment, their gaping mouths still screaming, screaming, screaming. Daniel clamped his hands over his ears. It didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from the air. It was in him. His legs buckled, and he fell to his knees, his body racked with something worse than fear, pure, crushing despair. There is no way out. The thought slid into his mind like a needle through flesh. I will never leave this place. His chest heaved in broken sobs. The bluish glow around him had dimmed, the shadows creeping in, tightening like a noose. He tried to scream, but his throat locked, his voice stolen. Then a hand touched his shoulder. Cold, too real. Daniel jerked away, eyes snapping up, and his breath stopped. A figure stood before him. Not a ghost, not a shadow. A man. A face he knew. His father. Daniel's mind reeled. His father had died when he was 12. Hadn't he? The man before him looked exactly the same as he did back then. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered with exhaustion. His eyes, however, were wrong. They were black, empty. You shouldn't have come back. His father's voice was low, almost sad. Daniel could barely breathe. Dad? The man's face didn't change. You don't belong here. Daniel swallowed, his heart slamming against his ribs. I don't understand. His father knelt beside him, those hollow black eyes boring into him. You have a choice. The air stilled. The whispers around them paused. Daniel's skin crawled. "Stay here," his father said, his voice too calm, "or end the curse." A cold wave of nausea rolled over Daniel. He didn't want to ask. He didn't want to know. But his lips moved anyway. How? His father reached into the darkness and pulled something out. Daniel's stomach lurched. A knife, ancient, rusted, stained black with old blood. A sacrifice. His father's voice was softer now, almost gentle. A life must be taken. One bound to the curse. Daniel felt sick. His hands trembled as he stared at the blade, the weight of its existence pressing against him like a mountain. He knew what his father meant. To end the curse, he had to kill himself, or someone else. The air in the room grew thick with expectation. The whispers stirred. The ghosts, the shadows, the things in the dark, they were waiting for his answer. His father's face remained unreadable. "Choose, Daniel." And for the first time, the darkness felt like it was breathing. The knife felt heavy in Daniel's hands. The weight was more than metal, more than rust. It carried centuries of suffering. His father's hollow black eyes remained fixed on him, waiting, the ghostly figures in the background motionless. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the entire realm was holding its breath, watching, waiting. Then something shifted. The ground beneath him throbbed, pulsed, a sickening, rhythmic beat, like a second heart buried deep within the earth. The bluish glow flickered, and a voice, ancient and crawling, filled the air. "Now you remember." Daniel's body went rigid. The voice wasn't coming from his father. It came from everywhere. From the walls, from the shadows, from inside him. And with it, the memories came crashing down. He saw his ancestors, their hands dripping with blood, their hushed voices murmuring in secret, faces gaunt with fear. He saw rituals performed in the dark, standing before the same pulsating door he had found beneath the cabin. The entity had always been there. It had watched his bloodline for generations, whispering into their minds, feeding on their suffering. And long ago, someone in his family had made a pact. A terrible, unbreakable pact. "We offer you our blood, so that we may live." Daniel's breath shuddered. He knew the words. He had said them before. Another memory slammed into him. He was a child, 12 years old, standing beside his father, the doll clutched in his small hands, its glassy eyes reflecting something inhuman. The whispers had been inside him, even then, guiding him. And that night, his father had led him into the woods, into the cabin, into the tunnel, to the door. Daniel's hands shook. He remembered standing before it, just as he had now. His father's grip tight on his shoulders. "You must feed it, Daniel." His father had made him do it. And in the flickering candlelight, Daniel had held the knife. And someone he knew, had screamed. Daniel staggered back, the knife slipping from his grip, clattering to the ground. His breath hitched, his chest ached. He was part of this. His entire family had been feeding the entity for generations. And now, it was time for him to do the same. "You know what must be done." His father's voice was calm, steady. The whispers began again. Daniel looked up, and the shadows moved. From the swirling void, a figure emerged. A thing that had no true shape. A mass of writhing limbs, twisting faces, endless mouths, all whispering at once, forming a single voice that slithered into his skull. "You will take my place." Daniel's blood turned to ice. The entity loomed before him, its shifting form barely contained within the realm. Faces, Hundreds of them, melted in and out of existence, their eyes bleeding, their mouths stretching in agony. It had no one face, but at its center, there was his own face, watching him. A deep, guttural laugh rippled through the air. You cannot run, Daniel. It was offering him a choice. He could stay, become part of the entity, the next in a long line of suffering souls, bound to the curse for eternity. Or he could feed it, just like his ancestors had, just like he had once before. The whispers grew into a maddening roar, the entity stretching toward him, its many hands reaching, its mouths grinning. Choose. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He had seconds to decide. His hands curled into fists. His breath came fast and shallow, and then he made his choice. The last thing he heard was his own voice screaming. The road home felt longer than it had ever been. The trees on either side seemed to lean in, their branches twisted like skeletal hands reaching out, as though they knew the horrors he had faced, the things he had done. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness, but they didn't seem to push it back. Instead, the night closed in, pressing against the windows, as though it had become a part of him, something too close, something he could never escape. Daniel didn't look back. He couldn't. His body was numb, his mind a tangled mess of half-formed thoughts and dread that gnawed at his very core. It was like his soul had been torn out, and he was now adrift, empty and hollow, caught between worlds. When he finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked different. It was still the same house, of course, the old two-story building with its peeling paint, sagging porch, and creaking wood floors. But it felt wrong, as though it was no longer a place of comfort. The door was cracked open, just a sliver. He hadn't left it that way. Daniel's heart beat faster, but he forced his legs to move, to carry him to the door, to take that first step back inside the place he used to call home. The air inside was cold. Not just a chill, but an unnatural cold. The kind that seemed to seep into your bones. Like the house was breathing in the dark, drawing in the deadness that had followed him back. The silence was almost deafening. There were no creaks in the floorboards, no hum of appliances. It was as though everything inside had been frozen in time. He stepped forward, his shoes making no sound on the wooden floor. He glanced around, half expecting to see the doll in its usual place, on the mantel, staring at him with those cold, empty eyes, but it was gone. The mantel was bare, no doll, no whispers. Daniel's chest tightened. The emptiness was all-encompassing now. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in on him. He walked through the rooms, his mind swirling with confusion and dread, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The kitchen was untouched, the table still set with the dishes from the night before he had left. But the room felt cold. A draft swept through the space, though the windows were shut tight. The air was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. He glanced around again, searching for something, anything, that would tell him this was still his house. But it wasn't. Nothing felt right anymore. His footsteps led him upstairs, each step slower than the last, as if his own legs were fighting him, trying to stop him from facing whatever was waiting. He reached his bedroom door, but before he opened it, he felt the weight of it. The oppressive, suffocating air that pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. When he stepped inside, the room was dim, the curtains drawn tight against the night. The bed was undisturbed, but the room felt alive, not in a comforting, familiar way, but in a sense that something else was there, something that didn't belong. The mirror across the room caught his attention. It was dirty, the glass covered in a layer of dust and streaks. But even as his eyes focused on the reflection, something didn't feel right. He stared. It was him. Of course it was. His own reflection. But the way he stood there, looking back at himself, there was something wrong with his eyes. They weren't his. They were empty, black, dark, and behind him, just out of sight in the reflection, was a shadow. A figure. Tall. Thin. It was standing behind him. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there. And then, the whisper. It was so soft at first, barely audible, but it grew, louder, closer. You can never escape. The voice was cold. Not like his father's. Not like any human voice. It was something deeper. Something that wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. It slithered into his mind, curling around his thoughts, wrapping itself around his heart, squeezing tighter with every passing second. Daniel spun around, his body trembling with fear. There was nothing there. Just the empty room, the darkness of the corner. The shadow was gone. But as he turned back to the mirror, his own reflection was still there. And the eyes, those dark, empty eyes, were still staring at him. Something shifted in the room. The temperature dropped even further. And for a moment, Daniel could swear he could hear the soft scratching sound of nails against glass. He stepped closer to the mirror, unable to tear his gaze away. The face in the reflection grinned. The grin was wrong, too wide, too sharp. The whispers returned, louder now, filling his head, drowning out everything else. You never should have come back. The reflection spoke. The lips didn't move, but the voice. You're ours now. Daniel's heart raced, and he staggered back, the room spinning around him. He reached out for the wall, trying to steady himself, but his vision was already failing him, everything bending and warping. When he glanced back at the mirror one last time, the figure wasn't gone. It was behind him. Right there, standing in the shadows, just out of reach. Its eyes glowed black, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, and its hand, a skeletal, elongated thing, reached out toward him. Before Daniel could react, before he could move, the world shattered. The mirror cracked, the glass split, sending jagged shards to the floor. And as the fragments scattered, the reflection stayed. It never left, and in the broken pieces, the last thing Daniel saw was the shadow closing in. The whisper screamed his name. The world around Daniel began to fragment. His body felt weightless, as if the very air had turned into a dense, suffocating fog. The mirror's shattered pieces scattered across the floor, yet they still reflected the shadow, an extension of his own nightmare. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the whispers that now filled the room, rising and falling like a violent storm. His hand shook uncontrollably as he tried to step back, his eyes locked on the reflection, no longer his own, but something dark and far more sinister. The thing that had followed him all this time, that had gnawed at his soul and twisted the world around him. It reached out again, the elongated fingers brushing the broken glass, as if pulling the very essence of his being into the shards, into the pieces of his own unraveling nightmare. It was too late for escape. The entity had claimed him. He could feel his strength draining away, like an invisible hand clamping around his chest, pushing the life out of him piece by piece. The house felt like it was sinking deeper, collapsing into a place far worse than the hell he'd just barely managed to escape. But as everything blurred around him, his eyes locked onto the words that flickered in his mind. Words he had almost forgotten. You cannot outrun it. You cannot escape it. A terrible truth began to unfold, one he'd been too afraid to see all along. The curse was not just an ancient pact his family had made. It wasn't just a matter of feeding the entity or sacrificing a life. The curse was about legacy, about the cycle that bound them to this otherworldly being. An eternal loop. Daniel had become part of it. Not just in his blood, not just in his choice, but in the very fabric of who he was. He was tethered now, and this house, this place, would always haunt him. The mirror, the shadows, the whispers, they were part of the curse, part of the price he'd paid. He could never return to the life he once knew. No matter where he went, the presence would always follow. In the end, he realized, there was no true escape. And then, with the final deafening silence of everything crashing together, the house was gone, consumed by the darkness that had always been there, waiting. Some cycles are meant to repeat. Some choices are made before you even realize you've made them. We are often too blinded by fear, by desire, or by family to recognize the true cost of our actions. And when you stand at the edge of something far darker than yourself, when the whispers and shadows close in, remember that even in our weakest moments, we are not as alone as we think. We are part of something greater, something older, and sometimes it is that something that chooses us. There is no running from what is written into the fabric of our lives. There is no way to break the cycle once it has begun.